but that imagination that you will be heard in a certain way and that your speech will circulate among certain people to generate you as a social type of person who then doesn't match your own desires or intentions, right? And simultaneously reinforces certain types of generally hierarchical, but not always, authoritative relationships. That's listening.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I'm your host, Talia Sherman, and today you'll hear an episode that's been in the works for a while. This episode, unlike any other I've done before, was a conversation in both theory and practice from start to finish. Michael and I sat down in a room with a microphone on the table in between us, and we ended up speaking for about 3 hours in total. But of course, it's my job to deliver something that's coherent, digestible, etc., all things that a 3-hour conversation is hard to be, and indeed was not. So today, I am proud to give you this version of all that Michael and I talked about. From listening to semiotics, to data, to critiques of science, linguistics, linguistic anthropology, and political discourse. As will soon be obvious, the guiding questions of this episode were inspired by my episode from October of 2024 with Jonathan Rosa. So if you haven't listened yet, I'd encourage listening now. This episode covers a lot, and while we discuss many different topics and circumstances, our set of rhetorical moves is surprisingly pretty small. Whether we're talking about Charles Sanders Peirce, Michael's fieldwork in Japan, categories of race and language, religion, etc., we continually relate the small, the anecdotal, the granular, the individual, to that which it is representative or symptomatic of, be it a statistical trend, a larger conceptual finding, a pervasive ideology, or a population-level practice. In other words, Michael delivers a masterclass in what a semiotic approach gives us. The ability to relate things symbolically and by way of how they are produced, constituted, or perceived. In still more words, yes, this is going to be a bit of a theoretical episode, but it's funny and polemical, and we disagree about a lot of things, so there is conflict as well as concurrence. So, I encourage you to let this episode wash over you, and if you find yourself wanting to hear more, as I have felt many times after speaking to Michael, then reach out, and maybe there will be a part 2. But for now, please welcome back into your ears, Michael Berman. Michael Berman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, for real.
Thank you. So to start, please introduce yourself. Tell people who you are and what you work on.
Yeah, thank you for that too. I am Michael Berman, in fact, and I work on semiotic, linguistic, and sociocultural anthropology. I'm really interested in ways that people come to feel disconnected or meaningless, alienated more broadly, in their attempts to find meaning and to connect to each other, right? And I've worked on that question primarily with a lot of fieldwork in Japan, though I've also done some fieldwork in the United States. And I'm always engaging with people and trying to learn. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So already there are so many things like jump out that I've noted in my outline, but first off, the omnipresence of the paradox for sure, right?
Yep. Feeling
meaningless in our attempts to feel meaningful. And then, of course, you say semiotic, I say semiotic, linguistic, sociocultural anthropology. So if I can sort of back up a little bit and just say that you are the Michael Berman who was mentioned in the podcast episode with Professor Jonathan Rosa, where I said, I met Michael Berman at a thing, a year and a half ago or so. And I said, who are you? What do you do? And you said, I work on semiotics. And I said, oh my God, that's crazy. I kind of freaked out. And I said, okay, name your favorite semiotician on 3. 1, 2, 3. And I said Saussure, very embarrassingly. And you said Peirce, which is the correct answer. And since then, we've been talking a lot about semiotics. So let's kind of start-ish with language, but also the fact that you are not solely focused on language. While you have taught linguistic anthropology courses and certainly published a lot of work that I would call linguistic anthropology. Yep. When you first introduced yourself to me, you said you work on semiotics and listening. You actually talked about listening, not relations. So let's start there. Yep. What is your theoretical framing? Why semiotics? Why listening, not speaking? It seems to me like our fields, linguistics, sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, privilege speaking and sort of ways of commanding language rather than ways of perceiving it and hearing it. Of course, there's so much work on scholarly perception, but like really, truly individual perception, not so much. Theoretical framing.
Yeah. So first of all, I thought your podcast with Jonathan was fantastic. And Jonathan has done a lot of really interesting work, including some, of course, on the white listening subject, right, which has been really useful and informative. But I think a couple things. One, if we're focusing on listening, you partially answered your own question right there. There is such a heavy emphasis on speech. And that's not just in our disciplines and subdisciplines, that's more broadly, socially, right? And so I think that to focus not only on interpretation, cognition, uptake, and things like this, but the ways that that which is not said but is imagined to nonetheless exert an enormous amount of influence on social relations requires a lot more attention. And one place to turn for that is listening, right? And so one of the reasons I'm very interested in listening is that it does so much that we're not yet fully aware of. And it has dynamics that seem to me to be different from, the dynamics of speech, which I think generates a lot of social effects, cultural effects, if you will, historical effects, changes what counts as history, how histories work, etc. It also presents a lot of interesting intellectual scholarly questions, right, which are yet to be asked. And for me, to go to the other half of your question, semiotics is broad enough to help us think through all of these things, especially when we're thinking with someone like a Charles Sanders Peirce, and it need not be Peirce. There are other people who've worked on semiotics in ways that I find incredibly insightful, useful, productive, etc. But at the very least, that take into account process, right, and the growth and also potential destruction of signs and processes of differentiation, right? So how do we even know what counts as listening versus speaking when so much listening requires some sort of speech, right? And why do we draw that distinction? And here, again, Jonathan is apparently haunting this conversation a little bit, but who does that serve and in what ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope that made sense.
As always with you, there's so much in what you say, and I want to tease out some specifics and kind of examples. So we're talking about like the dynamics of listening, the work of listening, which I think they're in a sense of work as in the verb, the work of listening, but then also sort of the growth and destruction of signs. So you're positing listening as a sign, but then also a process, an action, something that you can do. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of why listening generates these different social, political effects? The work of listening being different from the work of speech. Can we just go to some kind of granular level to talk about this?
Sure. I think there are a ton of different examples that we could bring up. I'll bring up one that is probably close to a lot of people, if I had to guess. Have you ever not said something because you were talking to a specific person who you didn't want to hear you in a certain way, right? My guess is yeah. And frequently that's an authority figure, but not always. Sometimes that could be a friend, right, a peer, maybe someone even you don't like, that you don't want them to have some sort of juicy tidbit on you or something like this, right? But that imagination that you will be heard in a certain way and that your speech will circulate among certain people to generate you as a social type of person who then doesn't match your own desires or intentions, right? And simultaneously reinforces certain types of generally hierarchical, but not always, authoritative relationships. That's listening. That's listening. And so to really break that down and see how, for example, listening relates to governance and something as big as the state or what we imagine as the state in generating effects like that, all the way down to friendships, right? Classroom relationships. Hello, like I have certainly not raised my hand many, many times because I didn't know how to pronounce a certain word, right? I knew what the word meant, or at least I thought I did, but I didn't know how to say it, so I didn't speak up. How many students, right? Like that's so many students. And that reinforces certain types of privilege. It also reinforces and creates certain social categories and changes your chances of achieving certain kinds of goals, aspirations, right? And so looking, at the specific ways in which all of that works, I think is really, really important to understanding social relationships and even language, if we accept that something like language exists in the world.
Can we go there? I know that we may disagree on this to some extent, but you have said before to me in office hours that you would defend the position that there is no natural object which we could call language. And that destabilizes and in some ways vitiates the importance of the project of linguistics, right? But that assertion is sort of basically the same as a lot of arguments that other anthropologists like Jonathan or Josh Babcock, who's also at Brown, have made about language being a project of political interests that coincided with the timing of modernity. I guess maybe that's how Josh would say it. So you're not really saying anything deeply radical in a room full of anthropologists, but you are saying something deeply radical in a room full of linguists and even next to me. Because for me, there's the work of saying that, right? I'm okay with saying, okay, right, this is like somehow language became this very like political weapon. It's a tool. The way that we perceive and produce it through scholarship absolutely retrenches all kinds of hierarchies that we don't want, right? But to say that there was never something that is biologically endowed, that is a natural object, that is language, that to me ignores something fundamental about language, which is that it is so systematic, which is that it exists in these particular ways, in all these patterns that we find everywhere. That you can do studies for years and years, psycholinguistic studies, neurolinguistic studies, and you find these results, that there's something specific about the left hemisphere that does language, that there is something about the way that we learn language that makes negation terms come at this time and quantifiers come at that time, right? Like we learn these things in very particular systematic ways that are generalizable across populations. Nothing to do, there's no cultural relativism in that. It's just that like all languages have these quantifier terms and qualifier terms and manner and path verbs. Like there's so much to language that I find it difficult to say that there truly could just never be a natural object.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things. I think, first of all, to say that something is not a natural object is not, in my view, to vitiate the attempts to understand that object. In some ways, it actually grants them more significance because it recognizes that they're partially creating the thing that they're imagining pre-exists their study of it, right? Which then changes the stakes of what something like linguistics is, because all of these kinds of awesome findings, and they're impressive, like there's so much going on and linguists are doing so much incredible work to find these kinds of patterns and whatnot. But it's also an act of creating categories that could then be seen as universal, right? And it's in the act of creating those categories that a lot of creativity is involved, right? It's not picking out something that doesn't exist, but it's changing the significance of what exists by singling it out and then putting it together with other things that then get called language or not, right? So it's not that there's just nothing in the world at all. It's not that we didn't develop vocal cords and, upright and blah, 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 right? And all of that stuff seems to me entirely reasonable and supported by good evidence, right? It's the question of when does that turn into something called language that can be treated in a certain way that then privileges certain uses of signs and devalues and obscures a bunch of other uses of signs, which then, a lot of work on what is called language ideologies, right? Mm-hmm. So what people think about language has shown that very clearly. Ideas about this so-called universal capacity called language are simultaneously ideas about people, at least as much as they are about this imagined capacity that we have. And that's important. That matters a lot, right? In courts, it matters. In national policy, it matters. In the daily treatment of other people, it matters. And for some, scholars, they're concerned about other forms of communication that may grant rights to other kinds of entities that are not considered human, right? That matters too. And so in that sense, I think it's very important that we recognize that language is not solely a given. It's something more historically specific that, like you just said, is tied to different interests and organizations of knowledge, which are then formative of different organizations of influence, power, authority, personhood, ontologies, et cetera, et cetera.
If I may ground that a little bit, you're saying that ideas about language are fundamentally, maybe not fundamentally, but are at some level ideas about people, right?
Yeah.
And that matters in courts, you said, in national policy, in daily interactions and treatment. So I would say I would jump to the classroom and for our valuing of other forms of communication. So let's go there. So for me, this is really relevant when we're talking about the Pidgin and Creole discourse around what's a language. And there's so much debate in linguistics around what is a Pidgin and what is a Creole, and is a Pidgin a language, is a Creole a language, right? And you have people like John McWhorter who say a Pidgin is not a language, a Creole is a language, but it comes out of a Pidgin, therefore it's a more simplified form of language. And he says that doesn't mean that those people are stupid. It doesn't mean that they're less worthy of rights or whatever. It simply means that at some level this came from a more simplified form of communication. And people go, well, what are you really saying there? What are you actually really saying? Pidgins arise at a specific context and moments in history where populations are merged together such that they have no common ground to speak on, such that they need to create a Pidgin that is, you could, I guess, say a more simplified form. But of course, even the more simplified form of language, quote unquote, is highly systematic, right? There tends to be a lot of phonological convergence and lexical convergence, but sometimes structural convergence is harder and takes longer, right? So it connects to hierarchies of the human, like Jonathan Rosa talks about. But let's bring it back to what you said, these ideas about language are ideas about people. In courts, it matters, yeah. How are you heard in a courtroom? We have had many people on this podcast who talk about their paper by Sharice King and John Rickford on hearing Rachel Jeantel and how she was not heard in a courtroom. Alex Walker, who was on this podcast, who is a lawyer, thinking about how we're hearing people in courtrooms who either don't speak English or speak various stigmatized dialects. In national policy, right? What are we being taught in classrooms? And who gets access to an education that they can understand and receive? And then also, in daily treatments and interactions, right? Because I think that this is sort of where Jonathan's really going to have this episode. Wow. But is it sort of this liberal/neoliberal orientation to learning and power to say, oh, I'm not critiquing your language practices because I think you're stupid. I'm critiquing them because I want to help you be able to get ahead, because you're not going to get ahead if you don't speak this certain way. I had a job interview last month and was being asked sort of I don't know, what is linguistics? What are you doing? This person's not in linguistics. And he said, this whole work sounds really fascinating, because I was basically explaining why that quantitatively there is no difference between the way that men and women use creaky voice, but yet continually women are perceived as using more creaky voice. And he said, that's really interesting. I had this grad student a few decades ago, let's just say, who sort of spoke in this up-talky way that kind of was very a quote-unquote ditzy way. And I was just telling her, maybe for your job talk, you might want to cut this out. That was a critique of her quote-unquote ditzy linguistic variation practices, not because I think you're stupid. This person was, again, a graduate student going on the job market, but because you're not going to get ahead as far as you could if you spoke differently.
Right. I think, though, one thing to really note in what you're saying that might not be as intuitive for everyone is that the evaluation there is not an individual evaluation, right?
Yeah.
And so language ideology and what we even think of as an idea is not located within an individual consciousness. It's shared. It's collective. It is social. So sometimes these ideas about language function even when no one individually holds to them. Right? It's yeah, I know that when you speak that way, that doesn't mean you're stupid or necessarily uneducated or this, that, the other, right? And yet, that person who's saying that has the belief that someone else believes that,
right,
and therefore enforces it, which is a process of listening to listeners, right? So you're listening to how the person who is going to evaluate this speaker is going to listen to them, And you're trying to then turn that into your own way of listening, right? And this is how you become alienated, arguably, from the process of listening itself. But it also makes language ideologies real. And that's why we can study them. It's not just something going on in somebody's head, right? Like there's evidence for all of this stuff. It's also why the framings of what counts as what, the particular abstractions we make, where we're paying attention and where we're not, matter so much. Because a lot of this stuff is functioning, it's generating effects that we're still not aware of. And even when we disagree with what is being said and what is occurring and the effects that are being generated, we don't always have the tools to make things better for people because we're still employing some of the same categories, right? Where like it's descriptive or not, right? It's language or not. Well, it's this phoneme, it's this feature, it's this, right?
Yeah.
We're still using those categories to understand what's going on. And those, to some degree and in some work, efface or erase ideologically the work of other histories that are at play so that different people can, like you're talking about with creaky voice, use the same exact kind of, way of speaking and be evaluated radically different and have that generate very different effects. And that can't be understood narrowly as something that's a given or that could be understood solely through a certain abstraction that we call language, right? It requires broader attention. And I think that's been what a lot of linguistic anthropologists have been saying and pushing for a really long time.
Thank you so much for that. I want to back up a little bit and just so what you talk about there, the listening of the listeners, the idea that our language practices are collective. It is our language ideology, not a particular language ideology. And this is obviously a big thing in like political discourse, is the idea that we focus so much on the individual rather than collective action. Yeah. That we tell the consumer, the individual consumer, to fight climate change, but not the corporation. That we tell you to unsettle your biases about language ideology, but not have radical top-down reform. So this is like, that's a big thing. But the idea that this is really our burden to carry matters. The listening to the listeners, the eschewing of personal blame, the eschewing of that to say that it's other people's, right? Kelly Elizabeth Wright and I talked about this when she was on, but like the idea that when we say to people, but generally women, that they should dress differently because someone else might have a problem. Because someone else might give you that job. Because someone else might assault you, right? I'm not going to. Crazy to me. And of course, as anyone could really say, well, these categories and ideas and ideologies are deeply consequential. It actually does matter. Yep. The idea that when your language is perceived as less than, therefore you are perceived as less than, that matters. Being looked at in certain ways because of what you're wearing and what you're not, feeling like you didn't get a job because you had cleavage, that matters. I have a question for you that I've had for a long time, which is, does and will ever data work? When Jonathan Rosa was on, we talked about how data does not unsettle people's biases. It doesn't always work. You can prove to someone that vaccines don't cause autism and they will still not vaccinate. You can tell someone, you can prove to someone that men and women don't use these small phonetic variables differently, and yet people still believe it. You can prove to someone that perception and production are really intertwined. I actually read like an econ paper last week about how like gender, like it was like, I mean, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like totally like created in the lab. Like people like over perceived like all kinds of stuff that just like wasn't there. And then even going into like social science, which is I think a broader thing that Jonathan Rosa talks about, is he says like, you know, what is social science's role in this like way of perception and production and reality, which is, and overdetermination, which is like, I read this great article ripping to shreds an economist's argument about single parent households. This economist wrote a book basically arguing like, I'm not being judgy. I'm saying, look at the data. Single parent households are more likely to be impoverished. less likely to have their children go on to, get degrees and earn a living. I'm not judging. That's just the data. We should have people be married in two-parent households. And this guy was like, yeah, like, you're basically saying the same thing as everyone that was like, I'm not being racist. I'm just looking at the data. Like, black people are stupid. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not being, in parentheses, he goes, he's racist. And he's like, okay, so by your logic, 2 is better than 1 because it's like twice the income and twice the time. You know what's better than 2? 4.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
that's right.
So I just want to know, like, when will data work? Because that's kind of all we have. Like, the merit argument is all we have to kind of say that, like, no, Black English is not reflective of stupidity. And, I don't know. That's all we have, right? Like, what else do we really have at the end of the day besides data?
Well, I would say, actually, we have a lot of things besides data. Data is what comes at a certain moment in the process of crafting knowledge, and it appears as if it stands on its own as a thing. But actually, data rely on categories, for example, concepts, practices, things like material infrastructure, labs, microphones, et cetera, right? And so when you lean too heavily on the data, you've already accepted so very much in terms of how you're framing that, what you're paying attention to, what you're not paying attention to, and what can appear as if it were simply empirical, right? So I think that a lot of the work that constantly needs to be done, and that is done by a lot of critical theorists, is to question the practices whereby concepts and categories are made such that certain findings can appear as if they were simply true, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that, I don't know, but there is some evidence that to some degree, when you switch the, let's call it the anchors of knowledge, right, you can actually be more convincing to people, partially because you throw them off balance, right? If you frame an argument in the same terms that someone has already been using to argue for or against something, they're very prepared to take up their stance on that, right? So, for example, if you say something like what you were just saying about, married households, blah, 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 people are very ready to say yes or no without thinking beyond the confines or constraints of the argument itself, right?
But what about, my thing is, like, you can argue that for that, like, your argument really stands, right? Like, race and gender and all these things are completely fabricated, completely. And the idea of the family or marriage, right, like, that's also pretty fabricated, right?
Yeah.
But when you're talking about, like, disease or ability or the sun and, like, sunscreen, and people are like, oh, I don't use sunscreen, it'll give me cancer or something, or, like, whatever. Like, that, I think there's a real referent there. Mm-hmm. And so for that, it's like, will data ever work? Like, it, like, it's so, it's because it's like, I think it's so crucially important, what you're saying, right? Like, when you're entering an argument with someone about something that's completely fabricated, it's important to do some kind of deconstruction and unsettle their terms. Like, you're telling me, like, if you assert, like, women are stupid, and then I'm in your frame of data and whatever, and looking at test scores, and women do worse on the test or whatever. Like, sure, yeah, you need to talk about various ways in which knowledge is created in this patriarchal way and, reinforced and framed in such a way that, and then whatever. Yeah. But, like, now, like, I'm on, like, the bluest side of Instagram or wherever, and I'm still getting, like, now it's, like, blue is sort of becoming this, like, extra left-wing kind of crazy nut. But, like, now I'm getting these stuff that's, like, your birth control will give you cancer. And, like, and it's just, like, that's, so, like, when will data work? Like, and then I, like, look it up and I'm like, oh, great. Like, wait, no one, like, oh, they were wrong. Like, surprise, surprise. But, like, even I'm like, wait,
right.
wait. Like, do I need to, like, go to the hospital right now? Like, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said there. I don't think we can, like, evidence seems to suggest that we can't rely on data itself, right? And so instead, or not instead, but at least in a complementary way, I think we also need to think a whole lot about the nature of expertise and authority and communication, right? And a lot of people have written about this too, but scientific communication for a very long time has alienated people, where they don't feel that they can grasp what's being said and they're being spoken down to, for example, right? And it doesn't frequently match what they perceive as their empirical life, what's going on, or the things they care about, right? And so that's a problem. That is a problem. We also have a situation where it seems that there's been a crisis of expertise and a crisis of authority, where people don't trust experts. And to some degree, everyone seems to, and by everyone, of course, that's right, it's not everyone, but people seem to feel that they have personally the right and the grounds to make claims on things that they don't know a whole lot about, right? Because there's been less of a focus on truth and more of a focus on other things for a long time. There's also, these very unique historical ideas about the individual right to speech, et cetera, that I think also play into all of this, right? And so until we really figure out different ways to, at the very least, communicate expertise, show people that, on the one hand, their insights do have a certain weight and validity when you're talking about certain things, right? Experience matters unto itself. But with other things, experience, as you were pointing out, can be really ideologically grounded and misguiding. So to find the balance there, which is very difficult, and to make people feel that they are important, so that then they don't have to constantly fight for their importance, right? I think in the long term is going to be a very important part of solving some of the real challenges that we're facing now with misinformation, right? But that goes beyond data, and I would argue requires making people feel as if they are valued in their lives and that they're not just stupid, and that the reasons they're feeling angry or alienated or confused or concerned, anxiety, etc., it's not on them. It's not their fault. It's a part of a broader system of political, economic, but also epistemological or knowledge production, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The first thing that I would feel like I was just transfixed. Thank you. The first thing that comes to mind is the book, The Forms of the Effects, by Eugenie Brinkema, I think, which I read this past semester. And that book was really hard, and I don't want to completely paraphrase it to the point where I'm getting it wrong. But basically, the effects have forms, is what she argues. And so the discussion in the class that we talked about a lot was this is an argument about form that then goes on to basically unsettle identity politics and the whole speak from the I perspective. And the idea that the second that I say that I am feeling some way, then somehow that's infallibly, unequivocally, forever true. Yeah. But what you're saying is we need to validate experience, but also be able to agree on fact. I don't know. The I perspective stuff bugs me as a cultural norm that we must adhere to at all times. That if you're not speaking from the I perspective, then somehow that's you can't say you hurt me. It's I feel hurt. Mm-hmm. But I don't really know what that actually whose interest does that serve? But yeah, being able to say the effects have forms and your personal experience shouldn't be negated, but neither should reality in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. And I think that in these really kind of general terms that we're talking in, people need to feel excited about being wrong, about having your own experience and perspective be partial, right? Even if you're not completely wrong, you none of us have the full picture ever. And so, when you find out that your particular perspective on the world is capturing something, but that something isn't the whole picture and may in some ways be occluding the whole picture, that could be really exhilarating, right? And I think that starts really, really, really young. But in order to have that kind of an orientation toward knowledge, you can't feel too threatened.
And you can't feel too personally attached to the knowledge, right?
That's right.
You can't feel like the attack on what you have said or the knowledge you have produced is somehow an attack on you, which I think is really hard, actually, in this day and age, where there seems to be this like great bifurcation where it's like it's either like you make money on your life, like you're content creating and you're displaying your whole life on TikTok, and that's like your life is your business, or there's the other side of it where it's like you're just like going into your 9-to-5 like work life complete balance like consultant, and like nothing that you do at work matters for you.
Right.
Which is, I think that's hard, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think also, right, it's interesting that you turn so quickly to making money because I think that's a huge part of this, right? Where instead of focusing on what's right or correct or true, there's a very, very strong tendency now to focus on what sells. And so even knowledge itself has become a marketed and marketable thing that then generates this kind of mistrust, distrust of the expert, because there's now a salesman of knowledge, right, who is put on an equal standing with the expert. And so, that affects everything. I think it's very important to find ways to talk about something like truth, but to have that incorporate rather than be entirely separate from people's experiences. So, a lot of feminist scholars have written about this, but there are notions of objectivity related to notions of truth that attempt to completely sever the human experience, perception, values, etc., emotion, from that which is collectively verifiable. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? It's also not how even hard sciences are actually practiced. And so here's where STS comes in as a really, really important field.
Science, technology, and society.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you. But, in the production of what get called facts or data, you have values, right? They're not entirely separate or separable. And that's not necessarily a problem. So again, here I think the fine balance that is very difficult to achieve, but that we need, is an ability to talk about something like a robust notion of truth while not alienating people and not pretending as if truth were on a separate plane, but rather it's right here. And then people could start to see the importance of things like tendencies and probabilities and fallibility, incompleteness, etc., which Peirce, of course, talks a lot about, but in the formation of what we do and do not know.
Michael, so much of your work is on listening and what we would call linguistic anthropology, and your research interests include like capitalism and secularism and things like that, right? I've read your website, been there quite a few times.
Thank you.
Powered by Squarespace.
Indeed.
Indeed, it is. You've done a lot of work in Japan, and hasn't come out yet in the conversation. But I guess really specifically, you have a great paper looking at like religion and religious leaders and religiosity in Japan. And the argument, the soundbite, is that compassion, in part, produces the alienation that it partly overcomes.
Yeah.
I feel like you're saying something about secondness in a Peircean sense, trichotomy, about relating terms. So what is going on there with that? But yeah, your work in Japan, and then, this like complete ever-present paradox of compassion and alienation and not being intertwined with capitalist structures and economies and yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that too. So I think obviously there's a whole lot going on there, but I'm definitely engaging with a certain reading of Peirce. So I appreciate that you picked up on that. More, though, on thirdness, right? So tendency, but also mediation. What comes between other things that partially then sometimes, depending on the conditions, forms those things that it's coming between, right?
Let's back up here. Okay, firstness is potentiality.
Yep.
Secondness, collision.
Collision.
Actuality.
Actuality, yep.
Thirdness, tendency, generalizability.
Yep.
Something like that.
Something like that.
And the way that we think about this often is the icon, the index, the symbol, okay?
Yeah.
The icon is iconic, right? A photograph of a person, iconic for the person, somewhat.
Well, Peirce has
Peirce
this very short...
indexical?
It's indexical.
It's indexical.
Because it's
Index
created by
presence.
the collision of the light. Right?
Yes, okay. Okay, so how do we do this?
Well, firstness, secondness, and thirdness can't be reduced to the particular triadic relation that you mentioned, right? Of the icon, the index, and the symbol.
Okay, fair enough. Yes, okay.
Right? So there's a lot more going on there, though certainly when describing the relationship between a sign and its object, the way that Peirce moves through firstness, secondness, and thirdness is with the icon, the index, and the symbol, right? The reasoning there is that, a symbol is conventional. So it's all about habit. So that's a thirdness.
Yeah.
Right? An index is something about collision, contiguity,
I think contiguity is the main thing there, because the main thing that people often talk about the sort of the footprint as being indexical of the thing that gave that imprint, right? So that is all contiguous. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's usually some kind of aspect of causality tied up with that, right? And some sort of a force or something. And then firstness, when talking about the relationship between the sign and subject, is resemblance, right? Where you're ignoring the differences between the sign and that which it represents in order to identify that thing through the sign, which comes to look like that thing.
So metaphor is a firstness often, right?
Can be.
These things resemble each other in some way that it is a firstness, right?
Yes.
The whole thing with thirdness, though, here being that, again, tendency, generalizability, suddenly something becomes a category or a concept, right? When I first came to you with my brilliant, at the time, I thought, idea about the triadic relation of sexual harassment, oh my God, different firstness, different secondness, same thirdness. You were like, yeah, that's what a label is. It's thirdness. Right? Like the second that we would recognize it as sexual harassment, that becomes that thirdness, that tendency, that generalizability, right? But there is something in there that has that firstness that would resemble something else, even though there are differences. Yep. And it has a secondness or a collision, right? The contiguity, the force, the interaction, the collision. Okay, so if we go again to this paper, the ear with power, ability to relate between relations, right?
Yep, that's right. So for that, I'd like to switch it up a little bit and move away from the, icon, index, symbol triad, and think more broadly about what a third is or what thirdness is and how it works, right? Because think about even something like a university. What on earth is the university, right? You can never see the university as a whole, right?
Yeah.
You can see signs of it. So right now there's a sticker, a Brown University sticker right behind you, right, that I can see that suggests that, okay, this room we're in is somehow related to this bigger thing called Brown University, which otherwise I wouldn't know and I wouldn't be able to see, right? Classes are all different, even though we recognize them as a type of engagement called a class. Professors, students, et cetera, et cetera. Also, a university is clearly not just the buildings in which those classes occur, because we had COVID, right? Like we had Zoom, we had these kind of things going on. So the university is arguably better understood as something like a third, a medium. It comes between us. It brings us together in ways that separate us, right? It is a mediation that we nonetheless produce. You know, the university is nothing without the faculty, the students, the administrators, the caretakers, et cetera, right? That we all collectively make it. So it's a relation among our relations, but at the same time, even though we make it, it defines us. It creates the units out of which it arises, because some people are professors, some people are postdocs, some people are students, right? And so we're all brought together. We wouldn't likely know each other without the university that we are producing, but we're also separated and categorized and created by that mediator that we produce, right? And that's how I was thinking about the state and governance in this paper. And so one of the things that I've been really curious about for years and years and years is why. Why is it so difficult to live a life that is actually oriented toward helping other people and yourself? I've been going to Japan for many, many years, since 2004, and I have a life out there. I have wonderful colleagues and friends and family out there. But I did most of my focused fieldwork, ethnographic research, after the disasters of 2011, which were utterly devastating. You know, you have the fourth largest recorded earthquake of all time. You have a tsunami that is unimaginably devastating, that kills approximately 20,000 people. You have so many people displaced, right? And it shook everyone in very different ways, to very different degrees, right? But I think there was an imperative for anyone, even loosely related to Japan, to try to help. And so I joined up with all of these volunteer groups, and because of my pre-existing relations with a lot of primarily Buddhist groups, I went with them to start with. And they were doing great work, right? A lot of that involved listening. And so one of the things I was curious about too, and still am, is like, you have 20,000 people who just passed away. And then you have a ton of volunteers from around Japan and around the world who feel that they have to go and listen to people. Like, that's the response. That's the ethical imperative there. I find that wildly interesting. And so I've explored the dynamics of that a little bit, the histories of that a little bit. But one of the other things that I saw was that a lot of really caring, excellent practitioners of listening, for example, would collapse after a couple of years of doing this work. And you could talk about that in terms of burnout and compassion fatigue and things like this. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, right? It's valid. But actually, there was a lot that escapes the purview of psychology that was going on. And it was institutional. And it was, you could call it sociological, where, for example, these Buddhist priests, who in the States we'd probably call them monks, but they're allowed to get married, so it's different. But they'd be doing this, and then the head temple says, look, it's been a couple years. What are you doing? We've been putting out so much money, and you've kind of been away from your home temple. And all you're doing is acting like a social worker, because in public spaces, you're not even allowed to use Buddhist language, right? You're not allowed to look like a Buddhist priest or a monk or something like this. You're not allowed to proselytize. So it's expenditure, expenditure, expenditure. We're getting nothing in return. Note the economic rationality, right? What are you doing? And these compassionate people would say back, well, if this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing, then what are we all about? I thought we're about suffering and compassion, right? Like, that is Buddhism, right? Yeah. and selflessness and things like this. And so they would feel alienated from their compassionate work because it felt separate from the work that they were doing at their home temples. But it also came to feel separate from their traditions more broadly and their backgrounds. And then they started to feel alienated from other people who were in these Buddhist organizations sometimes, right? All of that, arguably, and I argue this in that particular paper, was a part of creating a category and a concept of religion that was separate from specific or particular or individual religions, right? Because a part of what these people were doing in legal terms was providing care and volunteering in public spaces that they could not be prohibited from because the law guarantees that religion in general can't be prohibited. However, no specific religion is allowed to make use of, for profit of any sort, public space. And government in Japan can't be seen as supporting a particular religion. Of course, we could talk about what then gets categorized as religion or not, et cetera, et cetera. But what that wound up doing was making people efface signs of their particular historical traditions and where they were coming from in order to enact religion per se, religion in general, at the expense of, and sometimes literal expense, the members of the category, right? And that, for me, is this really profound and disturbing example of how compassion, the effort to share suffering in order to ameliorate it, can actually lead to a proliferation of suffering through various kinds of alienation. In a different kind of idiom or perspective, I also was trying to use that paper to get us to think about how categories and concepts relate to what get framed as the members of those categories or the units and things, the empirical data that are framed as justifying the use of a certain concept, right? And flipping that relationship and showing how actually the concept and the category make real demands on people, practices, things, and transform them in ways that match those concepts or categories, but can ironically break down the very basis upon which that category or concept relies, right, or rests. And that's more dialectical, right? There's something about that in there for sure.
Well, Peirce is in there. You're talking about the creation of the category of religion. And the category, as we know, is this thirdness, right?
Yep.
That's not medium, right?
That's
It's
right.
a medium, it's thirdness, it's category, right?
Yeah.
But it is separate from that which constitutes it.
Yeah.
And this is where your analysis goes beyond Peirce's framework, which is exactly what Jonathan Rosa said when he was here. We need to go beyond this framework because he said the Peircean framework often naturalizes that which it purports to describe.
That's right.
And we need to go beyond. So you're talking about how this category, and again, in general, right, thirdness is separate from that which constitutes it often.
Yeah.
But can you dissociate? I'm still confused about what are the religions themselves firstness?
Thank you. Also a great question. I think, so first of all, I'm sorry.
No,
you can't.
It's been on. It's great. Yeah.
If that's funny, then wow. But I don't think you can ever simply say something like, are the religions firstness, right? There's an aspect of firstness to the religions. They could be, in relation to something else, considered in terms of their firstness, right? We don't want to use firstness, secondness, and thirdness to completely reduce things, to take them out of their relation.
Where's the secondness, though?
The secondness is collision, right? So actually, that whole paper is structured around firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? What I saw analytically, and partially for the purposes of writing a paper and interpreting this wild stuff that's going on in the world that's super complex, right? But what I saw as firstness was the confusion and the lack of, in the very beginning, guiding tendencies about what to do when the tsunami struck. I mean, that wiped out so very much. And you had a bunch of bodies. You had people who were not identifiable. And that lack of identifiability is as close to firstness as you're going to get in kind of life. And that created a real practical issue for families and friends and city halls and crematoria and monks and priests and all these people with, what do you do? What do you do? And how do you, properly treat these people who have passed? And is it a problem if you do certain chants and not others, or prayers and not others? And that utter lack of identifiability, that was the firstness and the uncertainty that I focused on. But then that proliferated because in order to approach it, religious professionals couldn't stick with their common patterns of association, right? So you couldn't just have people that belong to so-and-so sect doing their thing with each other only, right? They had to meet up with other people and make claims to city halls to say, look, we need to be here. We need to be able to do this. And so that unidentifiability of the deceased people then proliferated into the relations between different religious traditions in a way that brought them together such that they had to engage the general, the thirdness, which was religion in general, right? Kind of as its own thing, but not in a way that simply affirmed each of the individual religions, right? It overcame them to some degree. And so there, it is different than Peirce in some ways. It's different than, and I don't know how interested you'd be in this, but a Durkheimian approach to religion and society. But the way that you could use Peirce to analyze all of that to some degree. But like you were pointing out earlier, and like Jonathan was pointing at in certain ways, and certainly other scholars have been hinting at, is that between firstness, secondness, and thirdness, there's conflict. There's conflict. It's not just smooth, hierarchical growing of signs, even symbols. Things are broken down. And in the process of abstraction, which is not solely a cognitive process, it's a social process, you, in some respects and sometimes situations, you do real harm to the things from which you're abstracting, right? And I wanted to take note of that and to start to think more deeply about the dynamics of those kinds of relationships and the ways that social qualities or qualia and quali signs and things like this, which are Peircean, but also which, some wonderful people have worked on in linguistic anthropology, to really think about how they're produced, right? In terms of not just growth, not just what would normally be called culture, but struggle, conflict, violence, contradiction, etc.
This is so good, but even just like to ground it, right? Anyone can see that the category of religion is separate from Christianity, Judaism, right. Buddhism, etc. Right? Okay. So like there's that, which is just sort of this like obvious thing, but like in between there's conflict.
Yep.
Like look around. Partisan wars happening like anywhere in the world, right?
Right. That's right.
But even something that isn't like this, something that you said to me once that I found really helpful was like all of that collision and all of those different levels of firstness and secondness, right? Like they would not exist if it were not for the category, but they are negated by the category.
Yeah, I think there are different ways that something like thirdness or categories and tendencies and types and things like this get related to individuals. And by individuals, I don't just mean people, right? I mean any sort of individual or practices, particulars, right, is really what I mean here. And you're totally right, by the way, in talking about the general as partially forming the particular, right? It's not only abstracted from it, it also changes that which becomes particular, right? And so that, too, is a challenge to empiricist sciences, right? Because it's not simply that you have a type that is, for example, language or this kind of language, that kind of language, and then you have examples of it. These types, these categories, these concepts, these different generals actually shape the particulars that then come to exist, which can then facilitate, though, different abstractions, right, and different modes of abstraction. Things are processes, things are changing, things are historical. And the conflicts and the paradoxes and the contradictions and the impasses, all of that means that you're never completely buttoning anything down when you come to a provisional understanding of it. That's also why even the hard sciences, the hardest of hard sciences, is constantly changing, right, developing, and in the long run tends to appear irrelevant after 1,000 years when you have radically different sciences. And this, of course, Kuhn wrote about this and paradigms and all of this. But
I think your methods have evolved, but
we could think of it.
Chemicals are still here.
But the chemicals that we're identifying, or even the category of chemicals themselves, not to say that it's not very useful now, I think it is, but might not be relevant in 1,000 years when there's a radically different understanding of, for example, what matter itself is and what it's made of, right? And if you find that, and this has no basis whatsoever, by the way, in actual findings, so forgive me, it's just an example, but if you were to find that something like dark matter, in fact, was the primary motivator of the relationship between, different particles that exist at what appears to be a far distance from each other but are entangled, and that affects something like human health, right? Then the idea of a chemical might not be the most salient or relevant, and it might not draw attention, right? Which is not to say that in a certain sense it wouldn't still exist. It still exists, but more as a potential for knowledge that may still be generating effects, right? But it's contradictions between not just particularities and generals, but also different modes of generalization, different concepts, categories, practices of knowledge production that change our relationships to the world.
And may I just say, early in the conversation you pointed out I was sort of there was this implicit economic model that I was talking about. Well, here you're talking about the implicit economic model, that there's going to be a low ROI on whatever your scholarship has invested in. And so that matters too, right? When you're talking about in these contexts in Japan, and the religious leaders are saying, well, where's the ROI? Where's all this, we spent all this money, we invested in all this compassion. Where's the coming together? Where's the lack of alienation, right? Yeah. And then even here, it's spending all this time figuring out the difference between agglutinating languages and analytic languages, to what end and for what? And what if dark matter does the, right? I don't know, the economy of all this, I think, it matters. And I don't think the answer is we need to remove the economic, because there's always going to be that economic tension. I think that's actually separate from capitalism per se.
I think that's probably right.
There's still going to be that economic model.
Although I think that framing it in terms of ROI, return on investment, is radically capitalist.
Yeah.
Right? rather than, for example, what are the effects produced by this engagement with knowledge, right? To immediately jump to economic impacts is the result not of some absolute tendency of all things, though you could argue that it is, right? I would argue that it's the way that knowledge production and other forms of production are organized, including compassion, such that the question of profit arises in the first place.
Right, because you're saying, like, you're tackling these questions about language or physics or whatever, and the question is never how does this relate to those who are impacted by it, but rather like the sort of internal to academic inquiry, ROI, institutional reward. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, that's important. I mean,
exactly.
But I think a lot of people come back and they say, well, what's wrong with just like being interested in math or something, isolated from anything else? What's wrong with, I don't know, doing these like controlled experiments? And I think there I actually just would put more pressure on the social scientists because your labs create things. Mm-hmm. When you introduce gender as a variable in the lab, like, right. Yeah, like the whole experiment was like, we're going to take a bunch of Spanish speakers and German speakers and give them objects on a screen because their pronouns are gendered, but like gendered differently. They gender objects differently, and then like see what adjectives they use to describe these objects. Like, of course you're gonna get like a more but like what? These kinds of experiments boggle me, upset me, but then it's also like then that has effects for years on end because then that's the groundwork for another study that says, see how I found this in these two other languages? Yeah, gendered pronouns really do affect the way we view objects. And that's crazy because it's like, well, look at America where, I guess English is a pretty commonly spoken language around here. We don't have gendered pronouns for objects. Pretty sure we have some sexism. Like pretty sure that's still
I think
is a
you're
thing.
probably right.
I think I'm probably right, yeah. Like, it just...
But then we wind up where we started the conversation, which is to some degree that linguistics matters a lot. Right? So to say that language is not a natural object is not to negate the importance of linguistics. Rather, it's to say that we need to be really aware of what we're producing when we invoke certain categories in certain kinds of study to produce what will appear as data later on that then gets used to justify all kinds of things, from the writing of papers to the distribution of resources to the creation of stereotypes about certain people and places and histories and how history works in relation to knowledge and all of this, right? And so I think that's really meaningful. And I think there are a lot of different ways to approach that certainly a lot of people are and a lot of different disciplines are. And they're using different theorists and different theories and different methods to get at it. But I'd like to believe that that doesn't mean that we're always at each other's throats. It's that we're trying to produce a more robust understanding and a holistic understanding of how any sort of process and knowledge and practice relate to life, the world, et cetera, right? But maybe that's too rosy. And certainly conflict and contradiction matter and help in that process too, right? Which means that sometimes you are directly critiquing, criticizing another way of approaching an issue.
Yeah. One way to maybe say that is a lot of people are talking right now about the reproducibility crisis in social science, right? Especially in psychology, which, as at least I know, I have real problems with psychology and their reproducibility crisis. But maybe what you're saying is like maybe the point is not always just that you need to find reproducibility. What are you reproducing? What's the thing what I was talking about in the linguistics experiment? Like, the reproducibility didn't mean that it was actually true. Gender just becomes more salient and more findable in the lab. And just because you found it in more languages doesn't necessarily make it true. But, like, maybe we need to move beyond, like, holding both. Like, yeah, your experiment needs to be reproducible, but then also, like, skepticism of just having reproducibility be the criteria for truth.
That's right.
Or for objectivity. Because there's real problems with reproducibility in sociolinguistics of like sociophonic variables not being associated with this identity or that you like need to find, right?
Yeah.
But then it's like, well, even when it is reproduced, what does that mean?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And under what conditions and for what observers is it reproduced, right?
I'm sure you could reproduce the Stanford prison experiment and it would be reproducible. Like, yeah, maybe. But like,
I suspect
we've
so,
all
right?
come to the consensus that was pretty bad, quote unquote, science, right?
Yeah, partially for ethical reasons, right?
Yes.
Which
Yes.
which certainly matter. But I also think there's something really important in here, and I appreciate your insight deeply. It's great, and it is important. But it points to the profound complexity of all that we study, right? And holistically, labs are amazing kinds of places. They are, and they try to work through that complexity and simplify it, reduce it to a quantifiable known number of variables that will then interact in a certain way that is predictable, entirely predictable. That's awesome. And it has generated, talk about effects, right? Huge effects on the world, many of which I think many of us would agree have been extremely positive.
Totally.
Right?
Because for some of us, knowledge actually is liberatory. That's like, I think the point that I was trying to get at the beginning, is that for some of us, data is liberatory.
Yeah.
For me, for so many people that I spend like all my time with, understanding, like looking at data has just, it's revelatory.
Yep.
It's crazy.
No,
and then
right.
Suddenly you go on to have different views, and that matters.
That's right, right? That said, when it comes to something that is primarily what we call social, that it could be slotted into the category or concept of the social, when you put it in a lab, that doesn't seem to make as much sense always, because if you wanted to frame it in these terms, the number of variables is just immense.
Crazy, yeah.
Crazy. And
yeah, you see psychologists doing experiments on like how attraction works. You're like, whoa, whoa. Yeah.
And it wouldn't surprise me if there's something to those findings. But at the same time, they are necessarily obscuring just as much as they are illuminating, right? And I think that it's important for us to recognize that in not just psychology, but pretty much any scientific or structured knowledge production, right? Or even unstructured knowledge production. Anytime you're knowing or attempting to know or understand, you're obscuring arguably more than you're highlighting, right? But that is a part of necessarily the semiotic nature of things, right? If you will.
Michael Berman, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Wow. Are we lucky to have minds like yours in the world? I really mean that. And to be so generous with your brilliance. I really appreciate it. I've never taken your class, and I probably never will. And you're still here on this podcast, and that's cool.
Well, I sincerely appreciate that. It means a lot to me, and I do appreciate all the work that you've put into your podcast, that you put into your scholarship. So really, thank you, and it's a real privilege and an honor to be here talking with you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I've been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with Michael Berman. As I said in the beginning, and I mean it, if you'd like part 2, reach out and let me know. It'll be on literary theory, presence and absence, and failure and reification through analytical inquiry. All amazing things. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, and circulate this podcast widely on your socials. When you're out for brunch, or lunch, or a matcha meetup, maybe a late night tryst. Maybe you're on your way to the anti-Zionist Hanukkah party to talk about all the awkward conversations that you had over Thanksgiving and reconnect with your high school boyfriend or girlfriend, and you want to send them a message that you take this whole autodidact thing super seriously, so you send them the podcast. There's never a bad time to be streaming. I'll be back shortly with another episode, this time with a computer scientist, so stay tuned. I will speak to you next time. Bye.